Shortly after I became a Christian, I began to hear about something called the Omega. I was told that Ellen White had prophesied of a coming false doctrine which she referred to as the Omega. What did Ellen White mean when she spoke about this Omega? Let me just give you the setting in which she used this word. Back in the early 1900s, roughly between 1902 to 1904, there was a man by the name of John Harvey Kellogg who became quite a prominent and influential person in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was actually a doctor who was in charge of the sanitarium at Battle Creek. And in fact, he was one of Sister White's friends. At least originally, he was one of Sister White's friends. And she and her husband even helped to send him through college. Dr. Kellogg wrote a book called The Living Temple. And many leaders in the Adventist Church apparently thought that this book was a wonderful book and wanted to publish it. But as Ellen White began to hear what the book was teaching, and then as she read parts of it for herself, she discovered that this book was teaching doctrines which would completely destroy the foundation of the Seventh-day Adventist faith. And so she spoke out against this book. She opposed the teachings of this book. And it was probably mainly because of her writings as well as her influence that the teachings of Dr. Kellogg did not become a part of the Seventh-day Adventist faith. Ellen White referred to the teachings of Dr. Kellogg as the Alpha of deadly heresies. And she said that the Omega would follow shortly. This is something that I've found and still find quite interesting. What was Dr. Kellogg teaching basically? He was teaching that God is in everything, which strictly speaking is not untrue, because God's power is what is actively present in every part of the universe, upholding and keeping all things in their appointed order. Dr. Kellogg, however, took the truth to an extreme where it became a falsehood. His focus would have led people to believe that God is everything. And there is a big difference. Not simply that God's power is in everything, but that everything is God. Now, these ideas might seem to be similar, but there is a great difference between them. On page 29 of The Living Temple, Dr. Kellogg wrote, "Suppose now we have a boot before us, not an ordinary boot, but a living boot. And as we look at it, we see little boots crowding out at the seams, pushing out at the toes, dropping off at the heels and leaping out at the top. Scores, hundreds, thousands of boots. A swarm of boots continually issuing from our living boot. Would we not be compelled to say, there is a shoemaker in the boot? So there is present in the tree a power which creates and maintains it, a tree maker in the tree." A person who followed Dr. Kellogg's teachings through to their logical conclusion would have ended up worshipping the trees, the stones, the flowers, and so on. The tendency of his teaching was in this direction, and Ellen White sounded the note of warning upon seeing this danger. Now, let me just read quickly one or two of the things which Ellen White said concerning this Alpha and Omega. Most of the quotations which I'll mention, which I'll read, are taken from the book entitled Selected Messages, Book 1. Most of what Ellen White wrote during this critical period were put together in a little booklet called Special Testimonies Series B, number 2. And the section that deals with the Alpha and Omega has been included in Selected Messages, Book 1. Now on page 197 she writes, "Be not deceived. Many will depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. We have now before us the Alpha of this danger. The Omega will be of a most startling nature." As you can see, the Alpha and Omega would involve a departure from the faith on the part of not just a few, but many. On page 200 of the same book she says, "In the book Living Temple there is presented the Alpha of deadly heresies. The Omega will follow and will be received by those who are not willing to heed the warning God has given." Notice that she calls it deadly heresies. She doesn't say perhaps or maybe or it could be. She says the Omega will follow. This was something that she saw coming, something that was a certainty. Now, take notice of what Sister White says. She calls it the Alpha of deadly heresies. Some of the literature which I have read on the subject of this Omega, in fact, the majority of books and articles have referred to it as the Omega of apostasy. But I've noticed that Ellen White didn't call it the Omega of apostasy or the Alpha of apostasy. She called it heresy. Is there a difference? Yes, there's a slight difference, but I think it's an important difference. There's a little difference in meaning between apostasy and heresy. When we talk about apostasy, what we are talking about is perhaps a falling away from the faith. This can be in a generalized sense. But when we talk about heresy, we are speaking of a specific point of doctrine on which a person changes or departs from the foundational truths of Christianity. Sister White said that what Dr. Kellogg was teaching was the Alpha of deadly heresies and that the Omega would follow. Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last letter. What she was really saying is, look here, we have the beginning of this thing. This is the primary deadly heresy. We are going to see the last, the greatest, the ultimate. Whatever it was the greatest, something of awesome proportions. She said it would follow and it would be received by many. I'd like to read another statement where she speaks about this Alpha and Omega. On page 203 of the same book, she says, Living Temple contains the Alpha of these theories. I knew that the Omega would follow in a little while, and I trembled for our people. I knew that I must warn our brethren and sisters not to enter into controversy over the presence and personality of God. Notice what she says. What she saw coming was so awesome, so devastating, that the prophet trembled for our people. She wrote all of this in the year 1904 and clearly said that this Omega would come in a little while. We need to make a note of this date because it's significant. We're going to come back and refer to it several times, because we need to be aware of the date when she wrote this in order for us to fully appreciate some of the other things that she said. We need to get a picture in our minds of the entire situation. On the basis of what we have seen so far, do we have any clues as to what the issue in this Omega would be? Notice what she said. The Omega will follow, and I knew that I must warn our brethren and sisters not to enter into controversy over the presence and personality of God. Does this tell us anything? It seems to me that this tells us very clearly that the Omega, whatever it was, whatever it would be something that would center around the issue of God's personality. This was exactly what Kellogg's heresy was about. It centered around the presence and the personality of God. But now, when she speaks about the coming Omega, she says, I knew I must warn our brethren not to enter into controversy about the presence and personality of God. Now let's consider another question. Why would Ellen White have regarded a false doctrine concerning who God is to be such a major matter that she would refer to it as the Alpha and the Omega of deadly heresy? She says Alpha and she says Omega, the beginning and the end. What I understand from this is that other doctrines are not as important as the doctrine that concerns who God is. Is this really so? Well, if you believe in the Bible, if you get your beliefs from the Bible, you will notice that the Bible teaches that the first and the greatest doctrine concerns who God is. In fact, Jesus put it this way. The first of the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. Mark 12, verse 29. That's the first and the greatest commandment. It concerns who God is and our relationship to Him. In fact, if you look at all the different Christian denominations, and even non-Christian religions, if you look at the creeds and the statements of beliefs of the different groups, you will find that all of them begin with the issue of what these different groups believe about God. In the Catholic Church, the Apostolic Creed begins, "We believe in one God Almighty." The Seventh-day Adventist Statement of Beliefs, specifically the second point, refers to the Godhead. And in fact, the original Statement of Beliefs, which was published back in the 19th century, began with what they believed about God. What is believed about God is always first, it is always primary, it is always of the utmost importance. And Ellen White, seeing this Omega coming, said she must warn our people not to enter into controversy over the presence and personality of God. In other words, she was suggesting that this Omega that was coming would be of such a nature that it would influence the thinking of the church with respect to the subject of the presence and the personality of God. That is very significant. And I think when you compare it with all the other evidence that we are going to put together, you will see that this was what she was trying to say. Startlingly, shockingly, there has been a change in the doctrine of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. One major change, and only one major change. And this change has been on the most vital doctrine. It has been on the doctrine of God.